It began with routine archival work. I was not looking for anything unusual. The project was straightforward enough, a survey of municipal art registries from the late 19th century, cross-referenced against administrative reforms that were themselves unremarkable. Cities were reorganizing their record-keeping systems. Bureaucracies were expanding. The industrial age had generated a new appetite for documentation, for inventory, for the systematic classification of civic assets. Statues, fountains, commemorative markers, all of it was being catalogued with a thoroughness that had not previously existed. The goal, as far as I could tell from the correspondence that survived, was efficiency. Nothing more than that. I was working through registry editions from a mid-sized northeastern city when I noticed something that did not immediately seem significant. A statue that appeared in an 1871 edition under one name reappeared in the 1884 edition under a slightly different one. The figure depicted was the same. The physical description matched. The location was identical. But the name in the header had changed. I noted it, moved on, and assumed there was a simple explanation, a clerical correction, perhaps, or an adjustment to reflect more precise historical information. These things happen in archives. Catalogers make mistakes. Subsequent catalogers fix them. I filed it mentally, under administrative noise, and continued. What drew my attention back was not the single instance, but the accumulation of them. By the third registry edition I examined, I had found 4 such entries. By the fifth, I had found 9. The changes were not dramatic. They were not the kind of renaming that announces itself. No figure was stripped of a title and replaced by an adversary. No obvious ideological reversal was visible in the substitution. What I was seeing was subtler than that. Names were shifted slightly. Descriptive titles were replaced by different descriptive titles. In some cases, what had been a proper name was replaced by a category. A figure once listed under a specific individual's identity was now catalogued as a general type. Civic benefactor, pioneer of industry, man of letters. The shift, each time, was from the particular to the more general, or from one specific identity to another. And in no case that I could find in those early searches was there any accompanying note explaining why the change had been made. That absence is what I kept returning to. Administrative records from this period are not sparse. If anything, they are almost compulsively detailed in areas that were considered matters of civic consequence. Budget allocations are documented. Correspondence between city offices survives in considerable volume. Disputes over paving contracts, arguments about the placement of street lamps, disagreements between aldermen over the siting of drainage infrastructure, all of this generated paper, and much of that paper was preserved. The renaming of statues, if it had been discussed, would likely have left a trail. It would have required, at minimum, authorization from some office. It would have generated, at minimum, a memo, a letter, a directive of some kind. If it was controversial, it would have generated debate. If it was not controversial, it would still have required a decision. What I could find in those early stages of the research was no evidence of a decision at all. The official position, and I want to be careful here to present it as it was given to me because it is not an implausible position, was that what I was observing was the result of cataloguing standardization. The registries of the 1870s and 1880s were being brought into alignment with new administrative frameworks, and that process involved correcting what were described to me as errors of specificity. Earlier catalogers, the explanation went, had used informal or locally familiar names that were not historically precise. The reform process sought to bring greater accuracy to the record. The renaming, in this account, was not renaming at all. It was correction. It was the record becoming more true, not less. It is a coherent explanation. I want to be clear about that. And it may well be, at least in part, accurate. But what it does not explain is why, in the cases I was examining, no documentation of the original naming rationale was preserved alongside the correction. If a name was incorrect, what was it incorrect about? If a cataloger had made an error, what was the nature of that error? These are questions that archival practice would normally answer, because the logic of correction depends on being able to demonstrate what was wrong with the original. The corrected registry entries I examined did not contain that demonstration. They simply presented the revised name as the name, with no reference to what had previously appeared in that space. The official explanation, in other words, does not explain the silence around the explanation. I expanded the search. I began working through registries from other cities, initially those in the same region, then further afield. I was looking for whether the pattern I had observed was local, or whether it recurred. What I found was that it recurred, not universally, and not with the kind of uniformity that would suggest a single directive issued from a central authority. But across 6 cities I examined in detail, and in several others I surveyed more briefly. I found the same basic phenomenon: statues appearing under one name in earlier registry editions and under different names in later ones. No recorded authorization for the change, no surviving debate, and in several cases, a striking repetition of administrative phrasing across cities that, as far as I could determine, they were not in direct communication with one another about their cataloging practices. That last detail is the one I find hardest to account for. When the same language appears in documents produced by different institutions in different cities, the simplest explanation is that there was a shared source, a template, a set of guidelines, a circulated standard. What I have not been able to find is that source. There are references in several of the registry prefaces I examined to broader administrative standards being adopted, but the specific standards cited are vague, and in some cases the documents they refer to do not appear to survive. Whether that is a consequence of routine archival attrition or something else, I genuinely cannot say. What I can say is that the temporal clustering is real. The renaming, or the correction, though if we accept the official framing, was not distributed evenly across the decades. It clustered. It concentrated in the late 1870s and through the 1880s, which is to say it coincided with a period of significant administrative reorganization in municipal governance across the region. Whether that coincidence is meaningful or simply reflects the obvious fact that administrative changes produce documentary changes is a question I have not been able to resolve. During this same period, oversight of public monuments and civic art was being transferred in city after city from local committees, often ad hoc bodies composed of private citizens, donors, veterans associations, civic clubs, to centralized cultural boards operating under municipal authority. This was presented at the time and in subsequent administrative histories as a professionalization of the process. The localized bodies that had originally commissioned and named many of these statues were, in this account, replaced by institutions better equipped to manage civic assets systematically. The language of the transition in the documents I examined is consistently managerial. Efficiency, standardization, proper inventory, long-term preservation. It is worth pausing on what that transition meant in practice. The organizations that had originally commissioned statues, that had raised the funds, selected the subjects, arranged the inscriptions, and maintained the community relationships that gave those statues their meaning, no longer had administrative standing in relation to those statues once the transfer was complete. The statues remained. The organizations, in many cases, continued to exist. But the formal relationship between the people who had cared about what a given statue represented and the people who now had authority over its documentation had been severed. I do not know whether that severance was intended. I am not in a position to claim it was. But it is a fact of the administrative record, and it is a fact that coincides with the documentary changes I have been describing. The public spaces in which these statues stood were also being reorganized during this period. Urban restructuring, street widening, park redesigns, the rationalization of civic plazas meant that many statues were physically relocated or had their immediate surroundings substantially altered. What had once been a neighborhood memorial might, after several rounds of urban development, or find itself in the middle of a commercial district or adjacent to a transit terminus. The statue persisted. The context had changed, and in the registry, the name had changed too. What the connection between those three facts might be, if there is a connection, I cannot tell you. I can only note that they occurred together, and that the records do not address that coincidence. There is another form of absence in this material that I want to discuss carefully, because I think it is significant, though I want to be honest about the difficulty of reasoning from absence. In the council minutes of the cities I examined, there is, as a general rule, no discussion of the renaming of statues. This is striking because council minutes from this period are not uniformly silent on matters related to public monuments. There are discussions of new commissions. There are arguments about funding. There are occasional references to repair and maintenance. In at least 2 cities, there are surviving debates about whether certain monuments should be relocated. But the renaming, where it occurred, is not reflected in these discussions. There are no motions. There are no votes. There are no aldermanic speeches for or against any change to how a particular statue was identified. One possible interpretation of that silence is that the renaming was considered too minor a matter for council attention, that it was handled administratively at the level of the cultural boards without requiring deliberation. That is plausible. But it sits in some tension with the scale of what was occurring. Across multiple cities, across multiple years, a significant number of public monuments were being identified differently in the official record. That is not nothing. And the absence of any public response, not just in council minutes, but in the newspaper archives I searched, in the surviving correspondence of civic organizations, in the records of the bodies that had originally commissioned the statues, is something I keep returning to. I have found no letter from any organization saying, "This statue is no longer listed under the name we gave it, and we would like an explanation." I have found no newspaper column noting that the description on the registry entry had changed. I have found no record of a plaque being removed or replaced, though the plaques on several of these statues appear, in the photographic record, to have been altered at some point during this period. The photographs I have found are not detailed enough to read the inscriptions, and I have not been able to examine the statues themselves closely enough to determine whether the physical plaques were changed. The registry says one thing, the plaque in several cases, appears from later photographs to say something else. What happened between those 2 points in time is not documented anywhere I have been able to find. Which brings me to what I think is the most difficult part of this inquiry, and the part I am least certain how to characterize: the communities that had originally given these statues their meaning, that had understood them, at least in part, through the names and context that had been assigned at the time of their commissioning, continued to exist after the renaming. In some cases, they continued to exist for decades, and what the oral histories and community records I have been able to access suggest is that, over time, the revised identities became the familiar ones. Grandchildren grew up knowing a statue by its catalogued name, not by the name their grandparents had used. The institutional record being the record that schools and newspapers and official publications drew upon, gradually overwrote the prior associations. Not violently, not with any obvious confrontation, simply through the ordinary operation of repetition and authority. The registry says this, and so this is what people learned. Whether this constitutes harm, and to whom, is not a question I can answer from the evidence I have. I am aware that it is a question worth asking. What I can say is that the narrative of what these statues meant, who they were for, what they were intended to commemorate, migrated from the communities that had commissioned them to the institutions that had inherited administrative authority over them. The institutions did not, as far as I can tell, conduct any deliberate public engagement about that migration. It simply happened in the records, and then in memory. There are questions that have emerged from this inquiry that I have not been able to answer, and I want to be honest about what I do not know. I do not know why the renaming, if that is what it was, clustered so intensely in the period of administrative reassignment, rather than distributing itself more evenly across the decades before and after. If this was simply a matter of ongoing cataloguing correction, one would expect to see corrections continuing at a roughly consistent rate as errors were identified. What I see instead is a concentration. Most of the changes I have documented occurred within roughly a 15-year window. After that window, the pace of change drops sharply. The record stabilizes. The new names become the permanent names. What accounts for that shape, the concentration, the stabilization, I cannot fully explain. I also do not know why certain figures were subject to the renaming, while others were not. Within the same city registries, I have found statues whose names did not change across multiple editions, surviving the reform period with their original identities intact in the official record. What distinguished those statues from the ones that were retitled is not apparent to me from the physical descriptions, the locations, or the periods of commissioning. There may be a pattern I am not seeing. There may be no pattern, and the selection may have been genuinely arbitrary, a consequence of which cataloger happened to be working on which section of the registry in a given year. I cannot rule that out, and I do not know why, in the surviving records of the cultural boards and administrative bodies that oversaw this process, there is so little discussion of what the renaming might mean for the communities connected to those statues. The managerial language of the transition, the emphasis on efficiency, standardization, proper inventory, does not include any apparent consideration of that question. That could mean the question was not seen as relevant. It could mean it was discussed verbally and never documented. It could mean it was considered and judged to be outweighed by other concerns. The record simply does not address it. and in that silence, I find myself uncertain about what to conclude. What I can tell you is where things stand now. The revised names have, in the cities I examined, become the standard names. They appear in guidebooks, in public signage where signage exists, in the educational materials produced by the cultural institutions that now oversee the monuments. In several cases, the communities that might have remembered the prior names have dispersed or changed to the point where the prior associations are no longer in living memory. The administrative record presents a continuous history, a coherent account of what these statues are and have always been called. The continuity is seamless or nearly seamless, which is itself a kind of achievement. Seamless continuity in an administrative record is not something that happens by accident. It requires, at minimum, that subsequent records consistently reference prior records in ways that do not draw attention to the seams. Whether there are seams and whether they matter is a question I began with a single anomalous registry entry and have spent considerable time pursuing without arriving at a definitive answer. I am not in a position to offer one. What I can offer is a set of observations that the changes were real, that they were under-documented, that they were concentrated in a specific period that coincided with a transfer of administrative authority, that they were not publicly discussed in the forums where such discussions would normally have occurred, and that they have persisted, unchallenged and largely unexamined, in the official record ever since. What I cannot tell you is what that means, whether there was intention behind it, whether the absence of documentation reflects a deliberate effort to avoid creating a record, or simply the ordinary tendency of bureaucracies to document outcomes rather than reasoning, whether the communities whose statues were retitled knew, or suspected, or never thought to question what they were being told. The registries are still held in the municipal archives of the cities I examined. The revised names are still the names in those registries. The statues are still standing, in most cases, though some have been relocated again in the decades since. If you were to visit them, you would find no plaque that tells you any of this. You would find only the name that was recorded at some point in the 1880s by a cataloguer whose reasoning is not preserved. And if you ask the relevant institutions what the statues have always been called, they would tell you, with complete administrative confidence, that they have always been called what they are called now. The records, as they survive, would support that answer. What the records before the records might have said is a different question, and one that I am not sure anyone is still in a position to answer with certainty.